Well, I'm so excited that you're joining us here at one of our locations or watching online for a brand new series that we're calling Pivot. And we're trying to answer over 5 weekends this question: how do I actually grow closer to God? That's really what these next 5 weekends are all about. And it's a question that I think a lot of people ask. For those of you who are maybe here and a friend invited you, or you lost a bet and like church isn't normally part of your life, you may have asked the question like, does God actually exist? Does he really exist? And here's the question I want you to ask is, if God actually exists, can I know him? Can it be personal? And for those of you who are Christians and maybe church is part of your deal, or you come here every week or you watch every week, I think we ask that question too, is how do I grow in my relationship with Christ? If God is actually real, can I know him? Can I grow in him? And so wherever you are on the spiritual spectrum, I'm really, really glad that you're here. And so we're going to spend 5 weekends drilling down on that question, because I think it's not just a Christian question. I think it's just a people question. I think it happens on a number of different levels, and you might be coming here for years and you're asking the question, is there more? Can I know God better? Can I know God deeper? Maybe you feel stuck spiritually, or maybe one of the reasons you don't go to church is not just because you don't believe. You kind of believe, but you're not sure whether God is actually real and whether he's personal and whether he's just more of an idea or whether you can get to know him. And I think often when you think about our faith, a lot of people leave off with this idea that the real pivotal question to answer in life is whether God exists or not. And so I've had these discussions with a lot of people. You've had these discussions with a lot of these people. And maybe you're trying to decide that right now. Like, is there a God or is there not a God? And often we leave the question right there. We just say, does God exist or does God not exist? And I think that's a great place to start, but it's not such a great place to finish. Because if God actually exists, there's another question. Can I know him? Can I grow closer to him? Can I actually be in relationship with him? I remember when I first met my wife, and that was when we were university students. First year, same class, and I saw her across the room, and for me, it was love at first sight. It was one of those things. For her, not really. I mean, it wasn't love at first sight. It wasn't like at first sight. In fact, she didn't even know I existed. It was just another boy standing in the hallway. But at that moment, I knew she existed. And that sort of settled that question for me. But it didn't really settle that question for me, because I was sort of attracted to her, probably sinfully, but I was attracted to her. And I just wanted to get to know her. And I wanted to know her name, and I wanted to know her story. And then when we met, I fell in love again for real, and I wanted to know everything about her. And we eventually got married. You see, that's what a relationship is. That's what a relationship's all about. And so the question is, well, could I actually have a relationship with God like that? Or is it really just, does he exist or does he not exist? Because a lot of people go, well, I believe in God, but it really, honestly, doesn't make any difference in your life. But what if it could? What if it could? And some of you, you're Christians right now, and you're struggling. You're trying to figure out, like, how do I grow in my relationship? I show up at church. I show up week after week after week. But some of you, if you were really honest, you would say, well, I'm not really growing. And you think, well, why is that? Well, showing up at church week after week after week doesn't make you a growing Christian any more than climbing a tree in an orchard makes you an apple. It just doesn't. Showing up doesn't guarantee growth in your relationship. And so what we're going to look at, just to give you the broad picture over the next number of weeks, is we're going to look at 5 things that consistently, over time, not just in our lifetime, but for thousands of years, have helped people grow in their relationship with God. And if you've been around Connexus since the beginning, you might remember some of these things because we taught on them before, but they're so important, we wanted to bring it back, give a fresh angle, and sort of remind those of us who have been down that road and introduce a lot of us who haven't to these 5 things. Because even Christians who've heard this material before or who have been in the church for years still find like this whole growth thing, how do I grow in my relationship with God, to be more mysterious than it needs to be. Now, these 5 things I'm going to share with you, you're not going to find in the Bible. You can't just turn to a chapter and there they are laid out in bullet point form. But they describe an experience that people in the Bible had, and they're phrases that we use to describe an experience that people over now thousands of years have had, and say, when I do these things or experience these things, I grow closer to God. And even if you're not a Christian, here's my challenge to you. If you're like trying to figure out whether God exists, or you're trying to figure out whether you believe in Jesus, or whether church is ever going to be a part of your radar screen and you don't know why you're here, I just want to encourage you. Pay attention to these 5 things. Because here's what I think. if you do them, if you cooperate with them, if you just decide to experiment, even for 6 months, or I would suggest a year, my guess is you're going to grow closer to this God that you don't even know whether he exists. My guess is you're going to find that these things work. If I do this, I'm still not sure about God, but somehow if there is a God, I feel closer to him. And so here are these 5 things. The first thing, and this is what we're going to drill down on it starting in a few minutes, is practical teaching. That one of the things that you should expose yourself to regularly if you want to grow in your relationship with God is practical teaching. Not just teaching, but teaching that gets put into practice. In fact, the way we like to teach at Connexus is we love to try to be as clear as possible in our teaching. We don't want you to leave going, okay, what did he mean? Because some of you, I'm not trying to slam other churches, but you've been in churches before where maybe the teaching hasn't been clear, and you walk out and you just spent 40 minutes or 45 minutes or maybe an hour listening to somebody talk, and when you walk out, you're kind of like, what did you get out of that? And you're like, I don't know. I don't even know whether I understood it. You ever been in a service like that? And then you know what we say? Well, I didn't understand it, but that must be deep teaching. Like that's deep because nobody could possibly understand it. I'm sure somehow I got closer to God in the middle of it, but I don't really know how I got closer to God in the middle of it, but it's deep. I know it's deep. Well, we don't want to provide that kind of environment. We think it's our responsibility as communicators, as preachers, to be clear. In fact, the Bible talks about that. It says in book of 1 Corinthians, Paul was getting frustrated with some of the churches, and he said, sometimes you guys say things that like nobody can understand. I'd rather have you utter 3 clear words than a whole bunch of things nobody can understand. And you'll also discover when it comes to practical teaching and when it comes to the Bible, because we're talking about teaching that's based in the Bible, that somehow, and you probably had this experience where you've been in a sermon maybe that you didn't even understand, but somehow it convicted you. Or maybe you were in a sermon that you did understand and was very clear, and somehow it convicted you. And you got to a point where you said to yourself, oh my goodness, I don't know what that is. Well, the Bible talks about that the Word of God is alive and that it has a power to it. And the real power gets realized in your life when you apply what you've heard. And that's what we're going to talk about for the rest of the day. So we're going to jump, that's number 1. Next week, we're going to come back, we're going to talk about providential relationships. Everybody's got relationships. Maybe you're married, maybe you're dating, you got relationships with your family, you got friends. But there are some relationships that people who grow closer to God say we're just providential. That's a big old-fashioned word that simply means provided by God. It was like God brought you into my life. You came into my life, and it made a huge difference. And we're going to hear a powerful story next week about how God uses relationships to grow people. And sometimes a lot of you struggle with this idea that God is invisible. Like, how come why can't it be more tangible? Do you know what providential relationships are? They're the means by which God's invisible grace becomes visible. They are. So providential relationships, that's another way people actually grow closer to God. Third thing is private disciplines. Private disciplines. And by that, we're going to focus on, there's many, we'll focus on 2 in particular, prayer and giving. And this is when you pray when nobody else is looking, not in church, not around the dinner table, but you pray when nobody else is looking, and you just build this relationship with God. And people who grow consistently say that when they pray and when they give, that's a hard one, when they give, if they do that as a discipline, that they're just going to do it when they feel like it, when they're not, it actually grows their confidence in God, that they become more confident that God is who he said he is when they engage in these private disciplines. 4th thing, and this is part 4 of the series, we're going to look at personal ministry. Today, when you arrived at our locations in Orillia and Barrie, you were served by very, very busy people who are engaging in this, in personal ministry. They're serving your kids down the hall. They're small group leaders. They do the check-in for your kids. They're going to serve tonight at Inside Out for teenagers. These are people who just decided that despite how busy they were and despite how unqualified they felt, they were going to step forward and they were going to engage in personal ministry. And it grew them. It grew them spiritually. And here's what they discovered, that somehow when they opened their hands and said, I'm going to serve, God opened their hearts. And so personal ministry is another way that people grow in their faith. And then finally, the 5th part, and this is a big one. I think everybody wrestles with this. Lots of people on the inside of faith, those of you who haven't made up your minds yet, we call it pivotal circumstances. And those are those moments in our lives where things just go bad. I mean, a pivotal circumstance could be a good thing, but often they're bad things. There's a diagnosis, there's a death, you lost your job, financially things are sideways, your marriage falls apart. And the question that everybody asks in the midst of those circumstances is, where is God? And believe it or not, you'll make a decision in pivotal circumstances. You'll either lean toward God or you'll lean away from him. And some people, in fact, a lot of people grow in those moments. And we're going to look at how that's possible and what do you need to do when terrible things happen. You can actually grow spiritually. How does that work? So those are the 5 things, and we'll come back to them every week, but those are the 5 things we're going to look at. Now, we're going to start drilling down right now on practical teaching. And that's sort of the goal, right? We want to be clear in what we say. And the challenge with Christian teaching, I think the real challenge should be that it's easy to understand. And I'm sure we're confusing sometimes. You walk out and go, what was that about? But our goal, whoever is communicating, is to be as clear as possible, because we don't want the difficulty to happen on the comprehension side. We don't want you to walk out and go, well, what was that about? Did he prepare? I don't get that. That was confusing. There were too many $5 words. I just don't understand that. We don't want the wrestling to happen on the comprehension side, on the understanding side. We want it to happen on the application side. And if you look at one thing that's missing in the church, I think often, and what's missing in a lot of our lives, it's knowing how to apply what we've heard. See, because you can be in church for years and years and years and years and still say, I'm not growing. I'm not. Some of you have attended church all your life and you've never felt close to God. You just haven't. And maybe one of the gaps that you're experiencing is a gap in applying what you've heard. Because the magic doesn't happen in the hearing. There's a lot that we can hear about. We hear that if you eat a lot of chocolate cake, you will gain weight. We understand that. The challenge is in the doing, right? Because chocolate's pretty good. You never see broccoli stores, but you see chocolate stores. It's an observation. The hard part is not in the understanding. The hard part is in the doing. And for a lot of us, we're like, well, I don't know where God is in the middle of my life. And some of you, let's just speak for a minute. For those of you who are like, okay, I'm at church almost every time. If I'm away, I catch up on a message. I read my Bible, but I've got these things in my life that are difficult. We're not even married and we're having problems in our relationship. And so I don't really know where God is in the middle of that. Some of you are married and you're not sure your marriage is going to survive till the end of the year. And both of you might actually be Christians and you can't figure that out. You're like, well, where is God in the middle of this? And you're frustrated with that. Some of you, your challenge isn't that you have a lot of challenges. Your life's going incredibly well. In fact, most people on the outside looking in would say you're incredibly successful. You've gotten promotion after promotion after promotion. You're making more money than you ever thought you would make. Your marriage is fine. Your kids are fine. Your job is great. It's going better than you thought it would. But there's something missing. And you don't know what it is. And the last promotion satisfied you for about 10 minutes. And life is good, but there's this niggling thing, this gnawing thing in your heart. And you're going, what is that? How come the stuff that's supposed to satisfy me doesn't satisfy me? How come the things that are really supposed to bring delight don't really bring delight? Why am I discontent even when I have every reason to be content? And for some of you, that's your struggle. And you can't figure it out. Others of you, it's not going well at work. For some of you, you got a boss who's breathing down your neck and he's saying, this is what you do. You overpromise and you underdeliver. You overpromise and you underdeliver. And you're struggling and you're like, okay, God, where are you in the middle of that? And what does your word say about that? And you're frustrated. And some of you, frankly, you pray all the time. You pray all the time. You pray every day. But you feel like your prayers get stuck on the ceiling. And you don't think that God is really speaking to you, and you don't think that God is listening to you, and you feel frustrated in your prayer life. You're like, so I go to church and I hear messages, and it's just not working for me. I'm not growing in my relationship with Jesus. Well, interestingly enough, and this is where practical teaching comes in, do you know that the Bible addresses every single issue I just mentioned? in detail. And you're like, yeah, well, the Bible, I mean, if you looked at it, it's thick and it's complicated. It's got an old part and a new part. I mean, you expect me to explore that whole thing and find out the answers to my problems? That'll take years. Well, maybe. But you know that there's a single book in the Bible that addresses everything that I just talked about? Single book, Book of Matthew. In fact, you don't even have to read the whole book. You just need to read 3 chapters, Matthew 5, 6, and 7. And you know, in those 3 chapters, everything I just talked about is described, and Jesus has an answer to those things. And you're like, seriously? In the Bible, Jesus actually responds to that? And the answer is yes. And the challenge, and I'm not putting myself above you, the challenge for me and the challenge for you is not that we don't hear that stuff. The challenge isn't that we don't read it. The challenge is we're struggling to apply it to our lives. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus addresses every single one of those issues. And even if you've never cracked the cover of a Bible, you probably heard of the Sermon on the Mount. It's some of Jesus' most famous teachings. Jesus addressed every single one of those issues. And if there's a gap between your life and what you hope to experience or what you think God has in store for you, you know what that gap often is? It's application. It's just application. That's all it is. Well, I read it, but you mean I have to apply it? Okay, all right. I've got to apply what I know. And Jesus, when he finishes those amazing teachings, where he talks about success that doesn't really satisfy, when he talks about letting your yes be yes and your no be no, over-promising, under-delivering, when he talks about relational difficulties, when he talks about marriage, when he talks about all of those things, he says, he finishes the Sermon on the Mount, not with more teaching and nuggets of wisdom. He finishes by talking about application. And if you look at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, which is the second part of the 7th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus does, in multiple different ways, he talks about application. And one, probably the most famous example, he says, you know what? If you hear my words and put them into practice, you're like the guy who builds a house on the rock, as opposed to the guy who builds his house on the sand. And he says, you want to be able to tell the difference of somebody who applied the teaching and didn't apply the teaching. Right now, when the weather's good, everything looks awesome. And the houses look great, but the storm comes in and the waves crash down, and the guy who built his house on the sand, who never applied what I just told you, his house comes crashing down and his life gets wrecked. But if you apply what I tell you, your house is going to be standing even though the storms come. But just in case we miss that, he goes back and he tells us again and again and again, the key, the difference is application, application. You have to apply what you know. And he uses another metaphor. In fact, we're going to look at it right now. So if you have your Bibles, you can open them or turn them on to Matthew chapter 7. We're going to look at just 2 verses today, verses 13 and 14. We're going to read from the NIV. And again, this is some of the more famous teachings of Jesus. So even if you don't know the Bible, you might have heard Jesus talk about that. And we're going to talk about how to understand what he just said in a few minutes. But it says this, Jesus says, enter through the narrow gate. For wide is the gate, and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate, and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. Now, fairly famous metaphor. In fact, over a couple thousand years of the Christian faith, this has been interpreted in different ways. And I remember growing up, because I grew up in the church, right? I remember seeing pictures, this sort of parable, this story depicted. And those pictures would always sort of amaze me and confuse me and terrify me all at once. And I couldn't find the picture I remembered, but I found an old one. And maybe if you grew up around church or you study church or something like that, you've seen this picture. So here it is. This is a picture of the broad road and the narrow road. And you can see there on the right, there's the narrow road, and people are going up to heaven. And then they're obviously on the left-hand side, they're not. There's just giant chasm, flames, hell. Is that really what this is all about? And people often interpret this saying, look, very few people are going to go to heaven. A lot of people are going to go to hell. And that's how they look at it. Now, I found a more modern depiction of it. And here we go, if we can show that picture. So there's a more modern adaptation. Your choice. Go up the escalator or down the escalator. And the part of my understanding that bothers me with that is like, who is going to pick the down escalator? Anybody in their right mind? I mean, you're not going to choose that. I'm not going to choose that. Honey, we haven't had enough hell in our lives lately. Let's go burn up today. No, nobody does that. And so when people are like, you got to choose the wide road or the narrow road, it's kind of like, well, is anybody with half a brain going to choose the road to destruction? Is anybody with half a brain going to choose the road to hell? And now, I believe that these verses have an eternal implication. I think they do, but I don't think that's exactly what Jesus was talking about. I think he had another application in mind. And like many things in the Bible, yes, that's true eternally. I believe there is a separation that happens eternally. And some people will go to be with Christ forever and others will not be, depending on your choice. But I mean, if the choice was that simple, are you going to choose heaven, you're going to choose hell? Who in their right mind is going to choose hell? Nobody. So let's look at what Jesus has to say, and let's look at what the verses really might be saying as we go through there. So back to verse 13. For wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. Wide is the gate. Now the gate is really, Jesus is talking about himself. Remember, he says, I'm the narrow gate. Enter through me. Jesus also said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And a lot of people struggle with that. They're like, that's so exclusive. And we talk about this a lot at Connexus, but my goodness, I think that's the most inclusive thing anybody could say. Because you don't have to work your way to heaven. You can't. You enter through a person, a relationship with Jesus. And who can enter into that relationship? Well, anybody. Doesn't matter where you were born. Doesn't matter what you used to believe. It doesn't matter what you did. Everybody gets in if you trust Christ. And so in that way, I think Christianity is the most fair and the most inclusive religion on the planet. Because Jesus says that way is open to you and to you and to you and to you. It's open to everybody. And it's personal. So Jesus is saying that, but then look at what he says. Broad is the road that leads to destruction. Now, the word broad carries with it a sense of easy. Broad is the road that leads to destruction. In other words, it's easy to go there, and he says many enter through it. Now, I think this is about eternity, but I also think it's about now, because Jesus just finished a whole bunch of teaching about now, and he follows up. The first parable on application is this one, and he's going, look, I told you some stuff that's really easy to understand, but it's going to be hard to do. It's just going to be hard to do. Careful. He says, because destruction is not just about eternity, it's also about now. And another way of translating the word destruction is ruin. Ruin. You and I run into people who ruin situations all the time. And it carries with it the sense that, he was financially ruined or his life was ruined or his marriage was ruined. It's that kind of ruined. It's got a very temporal, very immediate response as well. And Jesus is saying, look, wide is the gate, broad, easy is the road that will lead you to ruin. And lots of people enter through it. And you're like, okay, well, how does that work? Well, think about it. If I'm going to pivot one way, I kind of pivot automatically toward ruin. That's where my life goes. I mean, I have to always check myself from making bad decisions. So you're at the mall, and you're heading to the supermarket. And somebody, you know how you kind of spot a shopping cart ahead of time that's going to be your shopping cart? Imagine when somebody cuts you off and takes your shopping cart, what's the response inside? Lord, thank you for bringing them into my life. They're such a blessing to me. It's not what you think. There's 100 shopping carts. You had your eye on one. They took the one you had your eye on, and that you don't go to a good place, do you? I mean, what's your default on that? Your default isn't healthy. It isn't. Is your default to be celibate outside of marriage? Is your default to be monogamous within marriage? No. But we know a lot of people whose lives have been ruined because of relationships, and it looked harmless at the time. I mean, we just slept together. We're mature adults. But do you know a lot of people whose life got ruined through relationships that went south? Absolutely. Do you know a lot of people whose marriages went south because they just couldn't work it out? Absolutely. And again, you can recover from those things, but sometimes it's hard. And Jesus says, look, it's going to be tough. You can end up on a road to financial ruin. Just spend more than you make. And Jesus, in the Sermon on the Mount, gave some teaching about giving and about how to handle your money and all of that. And he's like, look, this is easy. It's not difficult at all to go off the rails. When somebody's angry at you, what's your default response? It is to be angry at them, isn't it? Jesus said, well, what's that going to do? If you lived out your life, you're angry at people, you're selfish, you're getting into things over your head emotionally and relationally, and you didn't really honor her the way she should be honored, and keep going. That leads to a place. It leads to ruin, either a lot of little small ruins or sometimes a great big ruin. And Jesus is saying that doesn't take any work, does it? It's just easy. And lots of people go there. See, here's the reality. Nobody chooses ruin or destruction. Nobody does. You never text your friend in the morning, hey, what are you up to today? I'm going to ruin my life. But you've texted people in the morning to discover by supper time they've ruined something. True? But they didn't choose to ruin it. They didn't choose destruction. They didn't like, I'm going to destroy my family this month. I'm going to get fired. That's what I'm going to do. Nobody chooses ruin or destruction. I'm going to go bankrupt. That's what I'm going to do. Nobody chooses ruin or destruction. Jesus says you don't have to choose it. It's just easy. In fact, you don't have to choose to reject me. It's just easy. You don't have to choose to be out of relationship with me. It's just easy. And again, even if you're not a Christian, this is just true. Where does your default go? Where does your compass naturally point to? Toward loving your enemies or wanting revenge against your enemies? And yet, even if you're not a Christian, you're probably saying to yourself, I know that love is the better path. Where would the world be if we chose not to retaliate? In a better place. And Jesus said it's not, because the road is easy and it's big. And everybody by default just goes there. You pivot that way by default. So nobody chooses ruin or destruction. But a surprising number of people, well-meaning people, end up there, don't they? I mean, you know some really well-meaning people who found themselves in a place of ruin. I know some really well-meaning people who found themselves in a place of ruin. Sometimes I've led myself into a place of ruin. Relationally, character-wise, it's not hard to end up in a place of ruin, and lots of well-meaning people get there. And again, if the choice was as clear as do you want to go to hell or do you want to go to heaven? It's like, do you want to ruin your life? Do you want to not ruin your life? Everybody chooses the side of life. But Jesus said, no, that's not the way it works. Because it's just easier to ruin it than not ruin it. It's easier to make mistakes than to do the right thing. And you just end up there. But small is the gate, and narrow the road that leads to life. And only a few find it. And again, this is not saying that only a few people are going to be in heaven. I don't think that's where Jesus was driving. Remember, he just finished teaching about what heaven is like, and you should live that way on earth as much as it's possible. This is the kingdom that I've come in to introduce. And the kingdom of heaven is near, and the kingdom of heaven is not far from you, and you can experience it. But it's small. And in the same way that narrow, the word narrow, or broad rather, has the connotation of easy. Narrow, the word that they use in the original Greek means to press in. It's difficult. It's arduous. It's like almost straitjacket language. You know, you put on a coat that's too tight for you is the root of the word. It's like, this isn't comfortable. It doesn't fit well. Jesus said, this is going to be hard. It's narrow, small. And only a few ever find it. Because it's easy to listen. Easy to understand, hard to do. But you know this. All the good stuff in life is hard, isn't it? all the good stuff of life is. To stay fit, to eat well, that's hard. To have a healthy relationship, that's work. Oh, the reward's worth it, but man, you got to get through some stuff to get there. To always choose the path of integrity at work, to not compromise your values, is that harder or easier than just letting it slide? It's harder. Jesus said, well, very few people find that. In the same way that eternally, probably a smaller number choose Christ than don't. In this life, it's hard. So how do you avoid the wide road to destruction? I think it's very clear. It's very clear. The difference between the wide road to destruction and the narrow path to life is application. That's it. It's just application. It's application. It's like, I'm going to not only hear, I'm not only going to read, I'm going to apply what I know. And the difference in that is how you pivot. Whether you lean toward applying the word, applying the truth, or whether you lean away from it. And I promise you, here's some homework. I would love for you to read Matthew 5 through 7. Just 3 chapters of the Bible, 5, 6, and 7. It's easy. Beginning of the New Testament, just look up New Testament, first book, 5 chapters in, just read 3 of them. And what you're going to discover is you're going to read it, and if you really read it, if you don't just like, oh, this is polite Bible reading, but if you really read it, you're going to go, no. That's ridiculous. Are you kidding me? And you're going to push back, and you're going to go, nobody can live that way. And it's good, that would be great, but like, oh. And really, it's all about how you pivot. Am I going to pivot toward applying this to my life, or am I going to pivot away from applying this to my life? Am I going to take a narrower, harder, pressing in road, or am I going to do the easy thing and go, well, I'm done my readings, on with my day? Heard the message, on with my day. Let me read you a few things from your homework assignment this week, Matthew 5 through 7. And again, this is familiar language. This is really familiar language. But Jesus is teaching, and he says, you want to know the way it was supposed to be? You want to know the way your life was supposed to work out? And again, even wherever you are spiritually, I think you could agree that if you followed Jesus' teachings, we would live in a better world, and you would have a better life. Because listen to what he has to say. Easy to understand, hard to do. But I say, even if you're angry with someone, you're subject to judgment. If you call someone an idiot, you're in danger of being brought before the court. And if you curse someone, you're in danger of the fires of hell. Now, where do you naturally pivot? It's like, well, I only called him an idiot because he is an idiot. That's where you naturally lean toward. I wouldn't have said it if I didn't feel that way. And Jesus is saying, and what Jesus is doing is saying, you've heard it said, do not murder. Most of our like, yeah, got that covered. Haven't killed anybody yet. Jesus said, you want to know what the law was really all about? Come here. It's about how you feel and relate to other people. So maybe you haven't killed anybody. Great. But when you think in your heart, you idiot, that's where murder comes from. Don't live that way. And then he says, you've heard the commandment that says you must not commit adultery. And you might say, well, haven't gone down that road. And Jesus says, well, great. But I say, anyone who even looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So who does that convict? Every man who's ever lived. That's who that convicts. It's like, oh, okay, well that, like, I can't look at her that way. I can't lust after her. She's not an object to be lusted after. No, she's my daughter. And I love her. And I created her, says God. So you think, well, I've never cheated on my spouse. Great. But when you look at a woman with lust in your heart, you've committed adultery. Jesus goes on to say, I say, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. See, that's just a sampling. That's just a couple of verses. And you're like, well, love my enemies. I mean, this guy dragged my name through the whole company. My name's Mud because of him. And it was unjustified. And you're telling me I need to love him and pray that you would bless him? Tell you what, I'm going to love my friends. That's what I'll do. And Jesus actually addresses that. He goes, well, good, everybody loves their friends. Everybody does that. It's not what I'm calling you to do. I'm calling you to love your enemies. Easy to understand. Hard to do. But the difference between the wide road to ruin and destruction and the narrow road to life is application. It's just application. And when you read that, this is how practical teaching works. When you read that, you're going to go, well, this is impossible. I can't love my enemies. I can't forgive him. I can't give. I can't look at people that way. It's impossible. And Jesus goes, good, now you got it. I can't do this, God. And Jesus says, that's the point. Exactly, you can't. But I can help you. And if you want to grow in your relationship with me, I'll help you. And I'll actually partner with you. And you know that selfish spirit, that like, hey, I'm in it for me and I'm going to do what I want. Nobody can tell me any better. Which sounds good, but eventually it gets ugly because that's what tugs at relationships, and that's what makes you realize when you look in the mirror, I'm a pretty selfish guy. You know what we're going to do with that? We're going to get rid of that nature, and I'm going to put a new nature, and I'm going to put my nature in. And Christians, just for a minute, those of us who go to church, man, you know why a lot of people don't go to church? It's not because of what we know, it's because of what we haven't applied. And if we started to apply this, if we were the people known for loving our enemies and being faithful in friendships and marriage, if we were the people who got known as being generous, what would the outside world think? What is that in you? Because I like it. I don't even know whether I believe in God, but I like what I see. And there's something attractive to it. And again, if you're not sure where you stand spiritually or you're on the front side of faith, I encourage you, try to apply some of Jesus' teachings and see if it doesn't make a difference. It will. You will like yourself better. I think it's because you're going to live the way that God designed you to live. And you're going to go, well, this is hard right now, but it leads to life. And your relationships will be better, and work will go better, and your finances will be better, and you'll feel better about yourself, and you'll just be in a different place. And you're going to go, this stuff actually works. Yes, it does. And you'll run into some bumps. It's like, this feels bigger than me. And God's, you might even come to a place where you start to believe in the God you don't believe in just because applying his teaching works. And it changes you. And so the hard part of hearing teaching and reading the Bible should not be understanding. It should be application. It should be application. That really, if you want to wrestle, you shouldn't have to wrestle to try to figure out what the preacher said. You should understand clearly what the preacher said and what the Bible said. Your wrestling match should be, how do I do it? This is almost impossible. I think one of the worst compliments a preacher can get is nice sermon. There were times where Jesus would preach and the crowd would go to stone him and kill him and throw him off a cliff. That's a good sermon. That's a really good sermon because people understood what he said and they're like, that's almost impossible. That's good. So when you go to lunch today, we're going to dismiss you in just a few minutes. When you go to lunch today, don't talk about whether you like the sermon or not. Talk about how hard it is to do any of this stuff, and then you're getting somewhere. The wrestling match shouldn't be during the message to try to figure out what on earth the preacher is saying. The wrestling match should happen as you leave going, but that's where the growth happens. Jesus says it's going to be hard. It's going to be narrow. It's going to be difficult. And you know what? A lot of people aren't going to make it, but you can make it. You can make it. And something inside you knows that your life is going to be different. Your relationships are going to be better. And you're going to act. And the reason is because you're going to experience some of the way heaven operates before you get to heaven. When Jesus showed up and he went, that's the kingdom of God. He's like, this is available to you, but I'll tell you, if you don't pivot right, you're going to miss it. And the difference between the broad road that leads to destruction and to ruin and the narrow road that leads to life is application. It's all it is. So this week, read Matthew 5 through 7. And I promise you, there is so much in those 3 chapters. And it's going to, if you really hear it, it's really going to challenge you. And then just do one thing with it. And here's the question I want to leave you with. It's this. What one teaching of Jesus could you apply this week? What is one teaching of Jesus that you could apply this week? Just one. Start with one. Because if you try to do the whole Sermon on the Mount, you might not make it till Friday. I'm just warning you. But if you just picked one, and maybe it's like, I got to not lust, or, okay, I can't do that. I need your help, right? You're going to grow. See, if you're like, I don't know what to pray about, trust me. If you try to apply anything in the Sermon on the Mount, you're going to have stuff to pray about. Won't be that hard. You're like, I can't do this. You might need to go see a counselor. You may have to sit down with a friend. You may have to get a coach. You may have to get into a small group and have other people like, this is just tough. Money, I don't know. And Jesus talks about money. Prayer, he talks about prayer. He talks about forgiveness. There's this guy, there's this woman, I just can't forgive her because of, well, you could apply that. No, but it's impossible. Apply what you know. Apply what you know. Because the difference between the broad road to destruction, to ruin, nobody sets out to ruin their lives, and the narrow road that leads to life in your family, to life in your relationships, to life at work, to life and health financially, to life in your spirit, to life in your character, is application. Let's pray together. Lord, sometimes the Bible's just hard. And the Sermon on the Mount, I know as beautiful as it is and how much it's praised, it's just hard. It's not hard to understand. It's just hard to do. It's easy to understand, but it's hard to do. And I pray you would give us the strength to do just one thing this week. And I pray, Lord, that we would see lives that are different, that we would see relationships that are made better, that we would see families that get closer, that we would see workplaces where there's more harmony, that maybe even if we all took this seriously, the headlines would change. Father, there's so much unapplied teaching in our lives. So help us to start with just one thing that we could apply this week. And I think already you probably impressed on our hearts what that is. And so I pray you would just give us the strength and the courage to apply what we've heard. Because we know small is the gate and narrow is the road that leads to life. And very few find it. But you're giving us the opportunity to find that. And we want to find it. We want to live this life fully alive. And we thank you for that opportunity in Jesus' name. Amen.